right, good morning, everyone. This is the roundtable on identifying, naming, and treating harm in new religious movements. My name is Joe Laycock. I'm from Texas State University. I am co-chair of the AAR's unit on new religious movements. A few things before we get started. We are being recorded, and this will be posted online in some form, and the recording was sponsored by the Reunion Institute. Before I introduce our speakers, I want to just say a little bit about the purpose of this roundtable. There's been increasing public focus on the question of identifying and preventing harm associated with or caused by new religious movements, as well as the appropriate therapeutic approaches to current or former members of NRMs. It is popularly believed that members of NRMs are in a category of their own and may require specialized treatment or scrutiny. There are few resources for therapists seeking to help individuals who are current or former members of NRMs. So this roundtable asks under what circumstances the alternative sexual and social practices found in some NRMs should be labeled as abuse, and what are avenues for leaders and followers to promote greater accountability and transparency. And we'll also address the question of whether NRMs require special therapeutic approaches, and if so, what they are. Finally, it will explore the possibility of dialogue between therapeutic professionals working with abuse and religious struggle in mainline religions and in NRMs. So our first speaker is Erin Prophet. Dr. Erin Prophet is a lecturer at the Department of Religion at the University of Florida. She studies religion, spirituality, and medicine. Her publications include Cults and New Religious Movements, forthcoming from Cambridge University Press, and Prophet's Daughter, My Life with Elizabeth Clare Prophet, Inside Church Universal and Triumphant from Lions Press. And Dr. Prophet will be speaking on comparing approaches to abuse in mainline religions versus NRMs.
Thank you, Joe. And thank you to my distinguished fellow members of the roundtable. It's very exciting to be here with you in San Antonio to launch what we hope will be an endeavor that can bring in individuals who don't normally speak with one another. And my background in public health makes me especially interested in looking at therapeutic approaches, and especially since we know that religion is a social determinant of health. So I want to start out with, these are difficult questions we're talking about here. What is abuse? How do we define abuse? And what do we do about it? I think a lot of people spent the pandemic, many Americans, watching streaming videos about cults, and the question of abuse was certainly front and center. But I want to begin my talk by actually sharing with you a report about another institution that was followed with an investigation that followed a high-profile suicide of an individual, an employee of that institution, who committed suicide in March of 2020 after being let go from his position with the institution. And employees had complained about his abuse, which included commenting on their genitals, sexting them on social media, and soliciting nude photographs. And these nude photographs were used for advancement within the company. So it had also been found, this institution tried to investigate itself and determined that there was no further investigation needed since the individual had left the company. Now, what institution was this, you might ask? You may think you know, but actually this is the Royal Ballet. And this example, and the individual who killed himself was Liam Scarlett, who was a choreographer with the Royal Ballet. Now, the cases of abuse that the employees reported obviously are serious and concerning. And by mentioning and bringing up this example in the context of a discussion of new religious movements, I'm not in any way trying to suggest an equivalence. For example, with the case of NXIVM, which many people are familiar with, quite heinous, case of abuse involving branding of women, etc. But what I would like us to do is to compare the reactions to the different kinds of abuse, because nobody, to my knowledge, is calling for the Royal Ballet to be abolished. Nobody's calling for it to be put out of business. I think what people would like is greater transparency, some kind of reform, some kind of outside investigation or something like that. So compare that with what often happens in new religious movements. Allegations of abuse really heighten the tension between the group and outside society and actually reduce the possibility that harm can be identified. And I'm very happy we have some distinguished scholars on this panel who can speak further to that sort of high stakes environment in which new religious movements with strange practices often operate, where they are not just fighting for over transparency or money, but they're fighting for their very existence. So it's impossible to read the memoirs that have come out by people who've been in new religious movements, or people who are undergoing spiritual struggle or who are trying to reform institutions. It's impossible to read those and not feel a great deal of sympathy and empathy for the people who've written them. And I have become an academic who studies new religious movements. I also study religion and medicine. I grew up in a group that was labeled a cult, and I can testify to the difficulties that happen when you have a high-tension environment. So I've been privileged to get to know some of the sociologists and historians of religion who study new religious movements, and I appreciate their approach, and I also contrast it with the approach by the so-called global anti-cult movement, which was very active in the 1970s in terms of labeling, providing lists of groups that were sort of dangerous, and the group I was in was on that list. Now, I actually felt that there was a lot of misrepresentation about what our group was about. There were attempts to destroy it legally, and it made it a very difficult and toxic environment in which to grow up. And so I have invited scholars to try to organize this panel so that we could hopefully reach a better way, because what we see is that the public narrative hasn't changed much. In fact, it's only gotten almost more involved in this sort of cult stereotype. And unfortunately, the case of NXIVM has made things worse, and I think we'll probably be just talking about that a little bit. My experience with so-called cult experts is that however scientific they try to present their research, there's no way to get around the fact that they are making value judgments about people's religious beliefs, and that they are confusing abusive behavior which goes on in institutions with the rights and legitimacy of the belief systems of those groups. And more recently, we've seen an attempt to weaponize human trafficking laws and to compare, for example, religious work with human trafficking. And I think that's a real apples and oranges mistake. I think it's a category error, and I think that it obscures the variety of positions that people may be in. If they're in a group, they may be struggling with their own faith. They may have family members inside and outside the group. They may have a variety of needs that should be met and that are not met by what has been called by David Bromley captivity narratives, which is really the only thing you get in many of these media presentations. So it's not out of the question, again, that the NXIVM case could be used and weaponized against small and vulnerable religious groups who are experiencing their own struggles in trying to reform and transform themselves. In fact, one prominent member of the anti-cult movement, Robin Boyle-LaSure, recently wrote that the Raniere case established precedent for using the human trafficking statutes, among other grounds, to pursue justice for victims of high-demand groups. Now, the word high-demand groups is something that Stephen Hassan, another prominent cult expert, self-appointed, has basically said high-demand group is just shorthand for destructive cult, which is a word that is highly emotionally charged, and we'll be talking about sort of the use or not use of that word, I hope. But what also ends up happening in these narratives is that there's no distinction made between sort of a long and well-established group like the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, also known as the Mormons, and a group like NXIVM. According to these so-called cult experts, these groups are all the same, and they all use the same techniques to get people to join them. This ignores completely the fact that people are born into these groups, that many of them have been around for multiple generations, and it obscures, again, the needs. It also heightens tensions between family members who are seeking better relationships with their children or relatives who may be in a group. And so I personally believe that Stephen Hassan's approach, as well as the approach of Rick Ross, who is another person who gets interviewed a lot, have made things profoundly worse for many groups, and I think it's important to try to establish a different therapeutic approach, which is what I hope we're doing today. Now, the question of whether individuals have a right, or individuals who are being counseled should be able to say, I was in a cult and I was brainwashed, because we hear obviously many people saying that in the media today. What is a therapist to do when one of their patients uses this type of narrative? Well, I personally think that it's not up to us as religion scholars to try to police the language, but I think it's important for us to point out the difficulties with some of this language, because especially the word cult and the international anti-cult movement has been used and weaponized by governments outside the United States to persecute religious minorities, and this is happening actively today. And so I think it's important to make people aware of the dangers of this term, even as we also acknowledge that people who've been in very difficult situations and been abused perhaps have the right to use these terms. Now, there was a very interesting study on deconversion that was published in 2009 by Hans Streib and Ralph Hood and colleagues, which published interviews and very interesting qualitative research, and for the first time actually brought together people who are undergoing faith transitions out of new religious movements or from one into another, and people who are undergoing faith transitions out of mainline religions. So, for example, we know that mainline Protestant and Catholic religions are losing people at an enormous rate, and so it's important that we have good qualitative work done. And they bring up the example of Erica, who is a former member of what she called a cult, what they interviewed for their book, and they pointed out that her interview actually spoke against the narrative. In her interview, she had agency. She was making decisions. She had friends inside and outside the group. She left slowly on her own. She still chose to call it a cult, but she did not display any evidence of being brainwashed, manipulated in the ways that are often seen in these stereotypical tropes. And so I suggest that it's important to keep an eye out for patients who are speaking against the narrative and to point out their own agency. So finally, I would just like to say that as a public health professional, I'm aware that there's a large body of research, and we're fortunate today to have Jeff Levin here, who's a world-renowned expert in the research on the connections between religion and health. Because people who are in new religious movements, for them, their religion and their faith is a determinant of their health, just as for anyone in a mainline religion. And I would like to see the types of techniques that are endorsed by, for example, the American Counseling Association, which recommend that therapists who are working with people making faith transitions be aware of the significance of their religious beliefs and understand what it means to them and understand what the different kinds of struggle, a spiritual struggle, which is actually a term that gets used in the study of religion and medicine. People who are undergoing spiritual struggle may want to stay in their group, but they just aren't comfortable with certain aspects of it. Or they may want to leave, or they may pursue a trajectory into an atheist or secular path, or they may go back to a mainline religion. So we need more nuance around this dialogue. We deeply and desperately need better public discourse, and I'm very grateful to the Reunion Institute for sponsoring this video so that more people can be made aware of this body of research, more people can be aware of the need for better resources, and that the narrative sponsored by the anti-cult movement, although there are some well-meaning individuals in that movement, there are also people who have been profiting for a long time off of these discredited narratives that need to be challenged. So thank you very much, Joe, and that concludes my opening remarks.
Thank you so much. Our next speaker is Dr. Susan Palmer. Dr. Susan Palmer is an affiliate professor and lecturer at Concordia University. She is also an affiliate member of the School of Religious Studies at McGill University, where she is currently directing a 5-year SSHRC-funded research project, Children in Sectarian Religions and State Control. She has published 12 books on new religious movements, notably The New Heretics of France from Oxford University Press, Aliens Adored, Rael's New Religion from Rutgers, Children in New Religions from Rutgers, and Moon Sisters, Krishna Mothers, and Rajneesh Lovers from Syracuse University Press. Dr. Palmer will be speaking today on defining the alternative sexual and social practices found in NRMs and when they are abuse.
Thank you. Thank you, Erin, for organizing this wonderful roundtable. Okay, first of all, I'd like to say that people often ask me how I first came to study new religions, and I don't usually tell them this, but like Erin and Jessica, I am from a minority religious background. My great-great-grandfather, Abraham Palmer, was part of Joseph Smith's community in Nauvoo, Illinois, and his wife, Delilah Palmer, gave Lucy Mack Smith a lamp, which is in the museum in Nauvoo. The reason I happen to be a Canadian is mostly because my great-great-grandmothers were sent up to Canada by their bigamous husbands. Most of the men in my family had only 2 wives because they weren't at the top echelons. And so that their husbands could be released from jail or come down from hiding in the hills. And so I recall many family discussions around the dinner table about religious persecution, about how polygamy works, about our intrepid great-grannies. And I developed a fascination with what Robert Elwood calls alternative altars in America. So to respond to Erin's question, what could be considered as harm or abuse in new religions, I will talk about harm to women, men, and children that happens inside these groups, but also harm that descends on them from outside, harm which is caused by state agents and journalists and the anti-cult groups. Now, as objective value-free sociologists, our job is not to judge or condemn or denounce groups that practice alternative patterns of sexuality and family, although sometimes it's hard not to laugh. But speaking off the record, I will express my personal opinion. Based on interviews I've been conducting over the years, I feel that the biggest harm to children and also adults in new religions is linked to defamilialization, or the separation of parents from children, the breakup of families. I've seen this cause enormous suffering, and it's quite devastating to children and parents alike. Sometimes this forced separation happens inside the group, and it's dictated by the leader or by, the group norms. Sometimes it comes from outside the group. It's the result of a police raid, negative media coverage, or social workers' investigations. Now, I will never forget several stories people have told me in the interviews. There was one young woman who grew up in the Children of God, or the Family as it's known today, and I was interested in hearing her stories about sexual sharing and flirty fishing, which she talked about quite cheerfully. And then she talked about how, as a child in the middle of the night, her beloved father had woken her up and said he had this wonderful new opportunity to move to Japan to start a mission, and she didn't see him for years. And for her, this was a tragedy. Another story is, I was interviewing a woman in the Rajneesh commune in Montreal, and she was talking about how she was going to undergo sterilization and have her fallopian tubes tied, and then she said how she'd had to give up this expectation of having children, and all her life she'd been wanting to have a child, but now she realized it was more important to be a sannyasin. And then what do you know, the next year Rajneesh flees Rajneesh Puram, the movement kind of collapses temporarily, and he says, go back to your lives, do whatever you want. And I remember how when I was interviewing her, I was dying to say, don't do it, you fool, don't do it, But anyway, I didn't, and I thought, no, that's not my role as an objective social scientist conducting an interview. But I've always felt a little bit of regret there. Another story was from a Raelian woman in the Raelian movement, you know, the big UFO group, and how she had, and her husband had participated in sensualité, you know, their free love thing, which is, you know, with same sex or other sex, and how she was devastated when her husband fell in love with a man and they had to split up. She wasn't expecting that. So, and I've also heard some inspiring stories about people in groups who actually rebel against separation from family. I talked to a father in OKC in Belgium, France, who actually kidnapped his kids because he realized his wife was planning to take them back to Belgium and he wouldn't have custody of them, so he just kind of kidnapped them and went to stay with his parents. And the kids weren't allowed to see the mother anyway in the group, so he won. And another case was a woman from the Institute of Applied Metaphysics. It's one of the chapters in my book, Moon Sisters. And she was told by the female leader that they had to send out a letter to all their relatives, to their parents, saying, I hereby sever the genetic link. So don't communicate with me anymore. Any letters you send will be returned. I will not speak to you on the phone because I'm devoting my life to God. So imagine all these parents getting this letter. Well, the way her parents responded was they bought a Winnebago and they drove to the commune and they just sort of said, hi, we were passing by, so we thought we'd drop in and say hi to our daughter. And they didn't really know how to handle it, so they invited them to dinner and they talked to her. And then the father said, I found a travel agent in the nearby village and I've left him money for a ticket. So if ever you want to leave the group, you just have to go to this travel agent and he'll give you a ticket and you can fly home. Wow, that's the way to go. Now, as for sex cults and Me Too, which, you know, we can't really avoid mentioning, and the NXIVM scandal, this has led to a heightened awareness of how women can be exploited and abused in, quote, sex cults. Although Keith Rainier seems to be the only man who actually enjoyed free love in his group. I've studied 3 different, quote, free love or polyamorous new religions, the Raelian movement, the Children of God, the Family, and the Rajneesh movement. And what's interesting about them is, you know, the tendency by journalists, of course, and anti-cultists, they don't like to be called that, is that the leader simply, you know, is a sex maniac or likes to, you know, dominate women, so he invents some kind of spiritual rationale, right? Sort of after the fact. But anyway, the spiritual rationales are quite different in these groups. For the Rajneesh, the idea is meditative surrender to Rajneesh through the Buddha field community, and through sexual encounters you can sort of plug in to that kind of spiritual force, which is called the Buddha field, which is basically Rajneesh's spiritual energy. So the idea was you shouldn't cling to, you know, exclusive relationships. And the way they put it rather crassly when I questioned them was basically the more people you sleep with, the faster you'll go towards enlightenment. But if you cling, you'll get, your energy will be stuck. So that's their rationale. Now for the Children of God, it's completely different. It's a selfless sacrificial act of sharing the love, Jesus' love, to help lonely and attractive men so they can get saved before the end time. At least that's the rationale for flirty fishing. For the Raelians, there's a more hedonistic and narcissistic, I guess, notion that by emulating the extraterrestrials who practice free love on their planet, the Elohim, they are experiencing pleasure which causes new connections between neurons in the brain. And this makes you luminously intelligent, and therefore the extraterrestrials will choose you for cloning and immortality. Now, the emotional pain which was expressed in interviews in these 3, quote, sex cults seemed to derive from unpredictable divagations in the movement, and also by breaking old taboos and embracing new systems of ethics, which took some adjustment. And But besides, male leaders imposing free love on their followers so that they can profit from this, there are a few fairly rare cases of female prophetesses sexually exploiting young male followers, and there are also several examples of homosexual leaders imposing themselves on young male disciples. How much time do I have left?
So we're at about 10 minutes now.
We've done 10 minutes already?
It's
Oh my
easy to
God.
get lost in,
Okay.
in all these.
So, yeah. Okay, so let's move on to harm to kids. Well, there's a huge level of concern which has been expressed in media reports in Canada, US, France, les enfants dans les sectes. And on the other hand, there's a high level of concern, there's also a very low level of knowledge, and it's difficult to find out about what's going on with kids in cults. First of all, there's the problem of access. The groups, if they come into conflicts with society, they don't trust researchers or journalists. Second, there are the research ethics boards, or the IRBs as they call them over here, which see children as vulnerable human subjects. There are the child rearing methods in new religions tend to be volatile, ephemeral, and they don't keep records. And fourth, sometimes the data collected by the courts or the school board is privileged to the court or shredded. But there are certain assumptions about children's lives in new religions, that the charismatic leader makes all the decisions, and the parents, as Margaret Singer said, are middle management, that parents are separated from kids, the kids are indoctrinated and have a poor education, are badly fed, that they're abused, and they're subject to forced labor. And there's also this notion that simply by a kid living in what the French call a closed vase clos, a sectarian community, they are being abused because they're lacking all these privileges that they would get, and also freedom of choice and so on. And it'll be hard for them to get a job, if they decide to leave. So what I decided to do, given this low level of knowledge, was I put myself through the grueling task of applying for a shirt grant in Canada. And so I came up with this project called Children in Sectarian Religions and and State Control. And the object was to study how these groups raise their children, the different ways, to examine how the state handles problems that come up to do with children in new religions, and third, to try to investigate the allegations of harm and what is the issue of harm in these groups. Okay, well, here are my conclusions. I hope I have a little time here. First of all, there's a big problem with the idea that if you've seen one cult, you've seen them all. Secondly, new religions change over time, and they tend to be self-correcting. They see problems and they fix them. Third, there are certain stereotypes about cult leaders who, and some cult leaders demonstrate a strong interest in their own special children in the group and how to mold them so as to fulfill their utopian ideals or prepare to usher in the end time. But other, quote, cult leaders have no interest whatsoever in kids and just leave it up to the parents, and that kids don't even go to the religious ceremonies, and parents say, if you want to join, wait till you're 18, that kind of thing. So now harm is defined differently in different countries, and I'm talking about spanking here because I've studied the 12 tribes for years, and their Bible-based spanking practice was a problem in 5 different countries, and I had to go to court. I've been to court actually in 5 different countries on behalf of the 12 tribes because of, child custody things or things like that. And it's interesting that in Germany you find one extreme. 42 kids were taken away, mostly because of homeschooling, that combined with spanking, which is considered an act of violence in Germany. and most of them weren't given back for years, and some of them never. On the other hand, in British Columbia, there was a year-long investigation of social service people, and they in the end said, your kids are great, no problem, goodbye. So you find quite a lot of very different reactions in different countries to exactly the same problem. Now, to come to the human trafficking issue that Erin brought up, I would agree this is a big problem. I was shocked when I went to visit the Ananda ashram in Assisi, Italy, and they told me how they'd just experienced a huge police raid and all their computers had been taken, and it was because a man who'd come to one of their weekend workshops on meditation had complained to the police that he'd been forced to wash dishes. And his lawyer said, this is human trafficking. And, I'm sure you all remember that lovely hymn by George Herbert. A servant with his claws makes drudgery divine, who sweeps a room as for thy love, makes that and the action fine. So there is this kind of rather beautiful idea that work, physical work, housework, can have a higher spiritual meaning. And, the Rajneesh have work as worship. Rosabeth Moss-Cantor talks about investment or voluntary labor, which makes a commune last. And of course, Zen monks will do sweeping as a path to enlightenment, satori, and so on. So it's quite shocking that today, voluntary work in a spiritual community can be seen as human trafficking, like forced labor or travail dissimulé. And another thing that's shocking is RICO, which sees a new religion as a criminal gang. And we have two messianic African-American prophets who were arrested and charged with RICO, Yahweh ben Yahweh and Dr. Malachi York of the Nawabian movement. And this means that their sentence was doubled, and all the assets of the group were taken away. Their land, this amazing utopian Egyptian theme park village in Georgia, was just seized by the FBI and trashed and sold, And it was all the labor of the people, it was their investment. So no one thinks about how they suffered. So yeah, this is a very sinister development. And I guess the final point I want to make is that I've been to court 6 times actually, and every single time the anti-cult narrative has dominated the case, the proceedings. And it's been my job to try to deconstruct and challenge the anti-cult narrative. And it's sad when in family court you have a judge who knows nothing about new religions. You have a poor family who can't afford a good lawyer. You don't have any jury. And yet you have someone who says, I'm a cult expert, and all he does is read the internet. He never goes and visits groups, and there's no longitudinal, and there's this symbiotic relationship between the journalists and the anti-cult experts. And so, it's very rough. And the result is often that kids are taken away who shouldn't be taken away. And this is tragic for parents, tragic for kids. And so I'd just like to quote Eileen Barker. Eileen Barker, in her fascinating article, which is called The Scientific Study of Religion, You Must Be Joking. She says she makes a call to researchers to academics to descend from their ivory tower and go out in the marketplace and make their voices heard, and so they can compete with these different versions of reality about what's really happening in new religions. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. Our next speaker is Jeff Levin. Jeff Levin holds a distinguished chair at Baylor University, where he is University Professor of Epidemiology and Population Health, Professor of Medical Humanities and Director of the Program on Religion and Population Health at the Institute for Studies of Religion. He also serves as Adjunct Professor of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences at Duke University School of Medicine, and as an affiliated member of the Center for Medical Ethics and Health Policy at Baylor College of Medicine. He is a Fellow of the American College of Epidemiology, the Gerontological Society of America, and the International Society for Science and Religion. Dr. Levin has authored over 240 scholarly publications, mostly on the instrumental functions of religion for physical and mental health, general well-being, and aging. He has written or edited 12 books, most recently, Religion and Medicine, A History of the Encounter Between Humanity's Two Greatest Institutions from Oxford University Press. And he will be speaking today on issues in researching health outcomes of harm and abuse in NRMs.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the intro, and thank you, Erin, for inviting me. It's a great honor. It's my first AAR meeting. I feel like I'm a bit of an outsider here in that I'm a biomedical scientist. I've been a lifelong observer of NRMs, have spent some time at a couple of ashrams as a visitor, working in the lab, things like that. I'm a hobbyist, I guess, an amateur. My approach to this issue is colored by my being an academic epidemiologist. I'm not an NRM scholar. I am not a religion professor like so many folks here. My subspecialty is in psychosocial and psychiatric epidemiology. So really, in these introductory remarks, I just have some methodological points I want to touch on. If there's more substantive content, maybe that can come out in the Q&A. But as a scientist, as a methodologist, I have a few things I want to say just about, I think, are the most important things from the standpoint of doing research on this topic, and that's coming up with good conceptual understandings of this concept. So I'll do something. I'll give you my take-home point at the beginning. I think that conceptual issues, as we've heard already, need to be addressed and need to be settled on in some way before we can address therapeutic issues and before we can conduct research. In this instance, I think we need a consensus on what harm is or abuse is before we can identify and specifically empirically evaluate treatments. And so as far as the way we do things. In my field, my discipline, that means things like case definitions and inclusionary and exclusionary criteria, and this might not be easy to come by, and I appreciate that. But I just want to lay out what I think some of the issues are. It seems to me, again, as an outsider, as an amateur observer, that this idea of harm or abuse, especially in this context, is partly or mostly or completely a politically and socially constructed phenomenon. Some reports of abuse or harm that I've seen, I think, need to be interpreted through a lens that reads certain groups in a disreputable light. And this is sometimes done with conflicting or maybe even marginal or non-existent justification. And the example I thought it was Osho. We've already heard about Rajneesh or the Branch Davidians north of Waco, with tragic results. Other reports would seem to be, quote unquote, abuse by any reasonable measure. Examples I thought of are Brother Stair. I don't know if that's a name you guys are familiar with. A well-known. I believe he might have undergone the transition by now. I'm not sure, but a well-known shortwave radio apocalyptic. I think of the prophet of the end times, and did really bad stuff to people who lived in this community. Another example that's been in the news lately, United Nation of Islam in Kansas City. So again, there's some reports that seem a little sketchy, others that there's a trial record. And so when there's a trial record, okay, then something went on. Whether we call it harm or abuse, maybe that's just grammar. But to me, though, it's what falls in between that's so contested. And there have been recent publicity just this past year on the remnant, Gwen Shamlin, the remnant. And if you read some of the court testimony, it does seem pretty awful, but nobody was ever convicted of anything. Now, in her instance, I believe there was a plane crash. She didn't survive. But again, the accusations are made, but nobody was convicted of a crime. I think that the contestedness is so strong in many instances that we, and by we I mean outsiders, should be wary of jumping to conclusions about groups that are portrayed, especially when they're portrayed by the media as obviously, incontrovertibly abusive or harmful. And I have to tell you, when I see that kind of narrative in the news, I don't want to say I'm skeptical, but it's like an alarm goes off. Why are they hammering this so heavily? And to me, it just kind of underscores how malleable and how socially constructed the issue is. Still, so on the other hand, there's always another hand. As a scientist, I'm not a humanities scholar or a religious scholar or anything like that. I'm a very left-brain scientist. I do biostatistics and all of that. I recognize that there's a need for some sort of objective markers of what harm or abuse is, whether it's physical abuse, whether it's sexual, emotional, since these are patently awful things and they produce lasting harmful effects in victims. But what these markers are that enable us to objectively, validly, reliably assess these things, it may be elusive. So now I want to touch on a couple of questions. I might not have answers, but just a couple of questions. How do we differentiate objective, heavy quotes around the word objective, signs of abuse, if it's even possible to do this edictly from the outside? How do we differentiate quote-unquote objective signs from symptoms of spiritual struggle, what psychologists call spiritual struggle, or inner change, or growth, or spiritual evolvement? An outsider, like me, an outsider's harm may be an insider's healing reaction. And it's interesting to me that so many new religious movements are therapeutically focused. They're defined as self-help or actualization programs, or there are health regimens. And think of like the Church of Scientology with its detox regimen, which I've talked to people completely outside of Scientology think it's absolutely the best detox program that exists. And people, when I've done fasts and things like that, I get a headache, I don't feel good. And before I'd ever done this, I thought, oh my God, something's wrong. But since then I recognize, oh, I'm just having that thing that happens the second or third day where you're detoxing. Well, imagine to an outsider seeing somebody undergoing some sort of a health-directed ritual and feeling really crappy and thinking, oh my God, we've got to call in the court system. Again, a little bit of an exaggeration. But I think that it's difficult here. We may think that we can identify real cases of abuse, but this can maybe be an outsider's conceit. Somebody's therapeutic response could be mislabeled by harm, as harm by an outsider, or even as an insider that hasn't processed their inner work, and is stuck in what Scientologists call reactive mind. So, I think if you're still doing the work, doing the processing, you yourself as a member of the group may interpret what you're experiencing as abusive, and it may not be. And certainly as an outsider, and like we heard, that, in the court system, people know anything about religion, know anything about NRMs, are very willing to label things as abusive that may be, but may not be. And there are consequences. So, the question to me, again, I keep saying I'm an outsider, but as a medical scientist, an outsider, how can I personally judge someone's experience and label it as abusive without knowing the details? And by that, I mean details about the group and details about the person, about the case. I think it's bad form in general for anybody. I get nervous about anybody outside of an individual person's therapist making judgments about somebody's psychodynamics. We see that a lot in the media, the psychoanalysis of politicians and public figures. Personally, I think that's very bad form. And I especially when you see therapists doing that are on the news, talking about someone that they don't know. Frankly, I think that's unethical. And it risks what, in my field, what epidemiologists would call misclassification bias. Again, things could be abusive, they could not be, we don't know. I recall even though I'm saying I'm a medical scientist and outsider of all of it, I actually started life in the 1970s at Duke as a religion major, and specializing in what back then were called cults, cults and sex. I guess we don't say that anymore. But I remember doing some work and doing a thesis on the topic. And I read an article, Bromley and Shoup's famous article about the Tanevnak cult. And it stuck with me. And I don't know if I might be dating myself pretty heavily, but Tanevnak is the word convent. backwards. And it was this narrative about all these things that went on in this strange cult, and you have to leave home, and then you have to dress differently, and you're cloistered. It's like, oh my God, this is a cult. And of course, these were Catholic religious. And I have no idea 50 years, 40 years later if this is people still read that article or what the attitude is toward it, but it just stuck with me. It left an impression. The second question I have, the last question, is how do we negotiate the contention between the recovered memory folks and the false memory folks? I reminded that phrase President Obama used several years ago. He said, someone asked him a question, he said, that's beyond my pay grade. And so I will say that's beyond my pay grade. There are some times in dealing with some issues, and this is one, I'm glad I'm not a clinician and I'm glad I'm not a therapist, because frankly, I don't know how I would address the issue. And again, I think it underscores, to me, the difficulty in validating, heavy quotes again, objective markers of harm. But take home again, without doing so, how can we evaluate effective treatments for people? So the last point, I suspect that we collectively are more likely to see harm when the putative victims of harm are members of socially disreputable NRMs. And we heard, Susan made this point. It's kind of an example of what political economists, what professors of political economy call rent-seeking behavior by moral entrepreneurs. I love that phrase. And I remember back in maybe some of you do too, back in the 1980s, early 1980s, the satanic ritual abuse flap with the claims that, 50,000 children were kidnapped every year for ritual sacrifice or whatever. I mean, the narrative seems crazy, but it was pretty consistently repeated, and if you can search the internet, you'll still find those same claims. And of course, if one tries to counter those claims, then you're an apologist for satanic ritual abuse. But the point is, there's not much evidence that 50,000 kids are kidnapped by demonic people to be cannibalized or whatever. So I think I would hope that there is a way to engage this issue in a more elevated manner. And again, I'm dating myself with this, and a Ted Gunderson or a Black Lightning, Ted Patrick, or a Walter Martin. I don't think any of these guys are still with us. But, back at my academic formation in this topic decades ago, these were some of the names out there. Hopefully there's a higher way to engage this. So to conclude, there's probably more questions and answers here, but to reiterate, I believe that the conceptual work, even if it's tricky, even if we can't come to a consensus, doing that work, like at a panel like this, it has to precede the empirical work to study this phenomenon or to evaluate treatments formatively or summatively for whatever purposes. I don't think that we can treat or study harm or abuse in any setting without first having some sort of a definition, and even if the definition's specific to specific groups. But again, this is maybe my bias as an empirical scientist, but I think it'd be very difficult to do. But and here's the difficulty. I think because of the intensity of feelings on this issue, it may be difficult to get there to everyone's satisfaction.
Thank you so much. Our next speaker is Jessica Pratezina, who is a PhD student at the University of Victoria in British Columbia. Her research centers on growing up in alternative religious movements, women's narratives of religious transition, and the development of wise therapeutic and social work practice with people involved in these religious groups. And Jessica Pratezina will be speaking today on what are some issues about children and abuse that are unique to NRMs.
Good morning. When I was a child growing up in the Worldwide Church of God, I ended up missing a lot of school. Our group celebrated a number of pseudo-Jewish holy days, and this necessitated quite a bit of travel. So at a predictable point each year, the administration would send a letter to my parents saying that I'd been absent too much, and if I missed any more school, social workers would become involved. My parents would send a letter back saying that I'd been absent for religious reasons and child protection never actually became involved. But I remember the specter of these social workers looming in the distance, ready to swoop in if we stepped out of line. They represented not help in the case that I was in trouble, but at least in my child's mind, a threat to my family and our way of life. Today I want to bring some context to child abuse allegations and new religious movements and suggest why it's necessary that helpers of all kinds, but I think especially child protection workers, have a nuanced approach to work with those in NRMs. That is, an approach that considers not only the veracity of child abuse allegations, but the work that these accusations are meant to do in the world. This work, I argue, has more to do with suppressing and controlling weird religious groups than it does with providing real help to those children who need it. This is important to me because I feel I was, especially as a young adult, someone who did need help, but that help did not come from social workers or therapists. Mostly, I believe this is because they were working from a flawed script about what it meant to be involved in an NRM. As we've already spoken about, there's little that unites the theology, organizational structure, and history of NRMs. Some represent very conservative value systems, while others extremely progressive left-wing political groups. Similarly, as Susan also pointed out, little unites these groups' attitudes towards children. Nonetheless, these groups share the experience of being popularly viewed as potentially harmful to children. As brainwashing fell out of scholarly favor and ceased to be a viable defense in American courts, accusations of harm in NRMs began to center instead on the well-being of children. In addition, the overall social and moral panic over children's welfare, especially during the 90s, created an atmosphere of concern for children more generally. Thus, mass raids emerged as one of the primary tools of child protection in controversial religious communities, especially those that lived communally. These raids are most often facilitated jointly between police and social services. While there are numerous cases of raids in the United States and Europe and Canada and Australia, the most devastating occurred in Waco, Texas in 1993. The ostensible motive for the raid was accusations of child abuse in the community. As I'm sure we're all aware, there was a 51-day standoff. Government agents stormed the compound of the Branch Davidians, and this act led to the death of 76 Davidians, including 26 children. The framing of fringe religions as necessarily harmful, members as brainwashed, and collective child abuse all played a role in constructing this disaster. State authorities worked alongside prominent so-called cult experts, whose expertise was sought though they had never had contact with any of these Davidian members and were not familiar with the theology of this particular group. Their insight and advice was based on their perceived broad understanding of all NRMs. Aside from Waco, perhaps the best-known NRM child protection case is the 2008 raid on the fundamentalist Latter-day Saints community, Yearning for Zion, YFZ. In 2008, based on a series of phone calls later determined to be fraudulent, state police and child protection authorities raided the ranch in El Dorado, Texas, and removed all 439 children at gunpoint in the largest mass child apprehension in United States history. Allegations of abuse were largely unsubstantiated, and the raid was deemed unlawful, resulting in nearly all children being returned to their families, though for most this occurred over a year later. The FLDS incident is revealing in several ways. First, it shows the way that the construction of collective child abuse is used to justify mass apprehensions, with the Child Welfare Department explicitly stating that the FLDS culture put children at risk of harm. Second, it demonstrates a pervasive prejudice against NRMs, particularly those with sexual practices and family structures that are considered atypical. In this way, sexual abuse in particular is portrayed as a problem typical of weird religious communities, while the intervention does nothing to address the systemic and well-known factors that do contribute to sexual abuse, which are poverty, isolation, and male supremacy. This case also highlights the way mainstream and alternative religions receive different treatment in the political and legal system. Though there is substantial evidence of child sexual abuse and subsequent cover-ups in the Catholic Church, there have been no mass raids on Catholic homes or Catholic schools or large-scale media efforts to portray all Catholic children at risk because of their religious participation. Last, and perhaps most troubling to me, the raid prevented meaningful help from being brought to those in the FLDS community who were most certainly suffering abuse. Remember, I said the allegations were unsubstantiated. This does not mean that abuse was not occurring. What it likely means is that the investigation was conducted so poorly that a therapeutic relationship was not established, and these children never felt safe enough to work with these professionals. This was a failed intervention. As Megan Goodwin eloquently explains, these actions, quote, discouraged FLDS women who might want to leave the community from seeking state social services and exacerbated the community's isolation. This is not to say that we should not concern ourselves with the plight of abused women, far from it. But we must also concern ourselves with how our attempts to save women from their religion often work to damage the very women we're trying to save. Several years ago, I spoke with a young man who had been apprehended during the 2008 raid. Like other children, he was subsequently returned. In our conversation, he described the difficult and abusive circumstances of his upbringing in the YFC community. Yet when he decided to leave, still a minor, he did so without reaching out to child protection authorities and relied instead on a network of informal support. His distrust of social workers and the child welfare system resulted in a limitation of the help that was available to him. Social workers are, at least in theory, the child protection ones, highly trained in recognizing, understanding, and intervening in abusive situations. Each state or province has definitions of physical, sexual, and emotional abuse, and these are the standards to which social work professionals adhere, always aiming to work in the best interests of the particular child in the context of their particular family and social circumstances. This is the ideal, and the best interests of the child has become a gold standard for child welfare practice. At the same time, throughout the history of child protection work, the best interests of the child has been weaponized against minority communities, especially racialized communities. It is no secret that Black, Brown, and Indigenous children are vastly overrepresented in state care. In Canada, for example, while they make up only 7% of the population of Canadian children, Indigenous children account for over 50% of those in care nationally, and in the province of Manitoba, this figure is 90%. Child protection concerns are regularly used as not so thinly veiled justifications for interventions in communities that are popularly seen as problematic, groups that for one reason or another are deemed in need of being controlled and surveilled. The importance of bringing an intersectional lens to work with children in NRMs can be illustrated by the lesser-known but highly significant case of the MOVE organization. Originally called the Christian Movement for Life, MOVE has been active in Philadelphia since the 70s. MOVE is a primarily Black, anarcho-primitivist group that lives according to the teachings of its founder, John Africa. In the 80s, the group was living communally in West Philadelphia, advocating for things like environmental justice, emphasizing the sacredness and equality of all beings, fighting against racism, police brutality. They received considerable attention from their neighbors and public officials because of their very vocal anti-government activities. After 10,000 rounds of ammunition, tear gas, and explosives failed to break down the heavily fortified MOVE house, the city of Philadelphia bombed the homes of members. The bombing caused a significant fire that destroyed 61 homes and damaged 100 others. The attack killed 11 members, including 5 children. The subsequent investigation and lawsuit demonstrated that officials were aware that children were present in the home at the time. However, no attempt was made to remove them prior to the attack. While orchestrating the attack, government officials expressed concern that these Black children might be armed and dangerous. In contrast, there would be significant concern over the welfare of children at Waco and YFC, and rescuing these white children served as the official impetus for these state raids. The same concern was not afforded to the Black children in MOVE. One of the reasons this discussion today is so exciting and important is that despite the highly publicized raids on NRM communities and the assumption of harm that so often characterizes NRM involvement, child welfare practice in controversial religions is not often taken up by social service scholars. At the moment, there are no articles from a social work perspective about mass raids as an appropriate tool of child protection, and there are only 2 on social service practice with children in NRMs more broadly. Accusations of child abuse and NRMs must be treated seriously, applying the same standards we use in every community. It is especially important to develop wise practices for working with alternative religious groups because abuse happens in these groups. Of course it does. Abuse is not a rare occurrence, and positioning children in NRMs at special risk deflects attention from this very true but hard to swallow fact about the society we live in. Misogyny, sexual abuse, exploitation, these are not problems of weird religious groups. They are our social and systemic realities. What little guidance there is for social workers and helpers more generally is, again, based on a perceived broad understanding of all NRMs. What is needed is the development of practice guidelines that are based on robust scholarship, open dialogue, leading to relational, creative, and inclusive practice that considers the specific realities of children's experiences within their particular religious groups. We need a kind of NRM literacy among helpers, one that extends beyond what can be learned about a group from an HBO special. Above all, I think we need to move beyond the deficit-based perspective in which children are pathologized because of NRM involvement. I'd be happy to take this up in more detail in the question period. While there can be a great deal of controversy and debate about the nature of harm in NRMs, as well as appropriate responses, this does show that we are all here because I think we care. We want to care for people so that they can explore different ways of being, and we also care that people, especially children, are not harmed while they're doing this. I hope that this is the start of a much longer and productive work that keeps us moving in this direction of caring. Thank you.
Our final speaker is Brett Merrill. Dr. Merrill is an associate clinical professor at Brigham Young University Counseling and Psychological Services and a board-certified psychologist. He has over 10 years of experience in clinical work and research. He serves as liaison between CAPS and the Religious Education Department at his university and finds great enjoyment in leading LGBT therapy groups that address the intersection between sexuality and religion. In his free time, you will likely find him playing chess on his phone, wrestling with his young children, or adding to his extensive legal digital movie collection. It's nice to humanize our speakers sometimes. Brett Merrill will be speaking on identifying best therapeutic approaches for current and former members.
Yes, good morning, everyone, and thank you for being here. As was mentioned, I am kind of a hybrid here, where I am both a scientist and faculty member at my school and also a practitioner. So I want to speak mostly to the therapeutic side of this, and as far as what we can do as clinicians and working with others. Although, just to give some context for my perspective and where this comes from, a lot of it will be experience working with students who are at Brigham Young University. Now, this is a university that is owned and operated by the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And so it does have kind of a cultural context that comes along with that. For instance, it's often known for its honor code and grooming standards at the university, where students who come are expected to abide by certain regulations. Some of those are not engaging in any like sexual contact outside of like marriage between a man and a woman. Some of that is also abstaining from things like alcohol, tobacco, vaping, drugs, etc. And as part of those regulations, if students do not abide by them, counsel is kind of against that and can be at risk for expulsion if continuing to go against those regulations. Now, with that being said, I think it's important to note what has been stated here in several different ways is not to overgeneralize what that means about any one individual student or any one individual in one of these groups. Because it's my experience as a clinician working with students within my faith and without, there's a lot of variance of what I see and stories that I hear and experiences that they have as well. So just to give an idea of that, I mentioned in my introduction, a lot of what I enjoy in my work is working with LGBT students. Now, this can sometimes feel like a contradiction or at least a mismatch for the university that I described. And certainly this is a really tough intersection for those students that come in and that I work with. So my students, I guess to say it this way, one of the questions that my LGBT students are often asked at the university, if their sexual orientation is known, is why do you stay at BYU? Or why would you even go to BYU in the first place. And it's interesting to hear those perspectives from the students when it's a genuine question rather than kind of a forceful, hateful one. Of most of those students felt inspired. They felt direction from God to come to the university, even though they knew kind of what that would mean for them, or some of the fear that it would have for them. But most of them wanted to have this dedication of wanting to stay within the church to strengthen their testimony or their faith in God this way, while also receiving a high quality education. Now this, is, you can see, becomes difficult to manage, especially as they better understand their sexual orientation or better understand their faith and kind of some of the questions they might run into. Now, I don't want to make this about kind of LGBT concerns. I feel like that's, somewhat of a separate topic or issue, but just knowing that that is a point that often comes up in my practice. One thing that I also, I guess, wanted to touch on is sometimes it's easy as an outsider in particular to look at the concerns of someone who might be going through a faith crisis or in kind of one of these NRMs and say, don't you see the hurt that this is causing you, or the troubles this is causing? Maybe life would be so much easier for you if you just kind of left or did this. And I guess to give an example or a parallel here is, I'm assuming most everyone here went through graduate training of some sort. And I think it'd be easy as an outsider to be like, don't you see that as a graduate student, you are overworked and underpaid and underappreciated? Why would you ever complete this program? And truly, I think just for those within NRMs, there's a greater purpose or greater meaning that makes it worth it for them to stay. Now, that's not always the case, and sometimes people will leave, but in general, I think there's something there that keeps them that's worth noting because it's strong enough or personal enough for them where they want to stay close to their faith or make those decisions. On a somewhat more therapeutic note, I wanted to speak just for clinical practice and clinical experience as far as how to work with people who are within an NRM, rather than making these kind of oversweeping generalizations. In 2000, well, to back up just a little bit, my therapeutic approach, I think, is similar to most therapists out there, where I consider the evidence-based treatments, best practices, if you will, and then I kind of merge that with my own personality. What fits best for me, what aligns well, and I find something in between that just seems to fit or jive. So in essence, I am an integrationist that way, which means I essentially use kind of a humanistic approach at my core, and then I will adopt skills or interventions or even theories from different approaches based on kind of the need of my client or what might be most fitting that way. And one way that I tend to manage religious concerns or questions in particular is through a multicultural lens. So in 2001, Sue defined what multicultural competence was and gave a definition that it is obtaining the awareness, knowledge, and skills to work with people of diverse backgrounds in an effective manner. And they go on to describe what each one of those might mean in more detail. For instance, awareness will often refer to me as a clinician understanding my own biases. So if I hear someone belongs to kind of an NRM, or maybe they belong someone in my own faith comes in and describes religious concerns, I'm not going to immediately assume that I understand everything that they are going through. Their experience could be vastly different from my own. And I hope that they don't assume the same thing about me, that I fully understand their experience when my experiences differed considerably. So just being able to question my own beliefs, my own values, my own opinions, and putting those in somewhat of a neutral stance, although it's never fully neutral, of course, but being able to fully immerse myself in someone else's experience and understand what they might be going through outside of my own lens that way. So that helps touch on the awareness side. The knowledge side, of course, is just becoming educated. Now, the difficult part about this is going to outside sources or external sources might give misinformation, might give very biased information. And so being able to educate mostly comes from my interactions with my clients, asking them questions. And instead of, again, assuming, just saying, like, what does this mean for you? What does it mean for you that you are at a highly religious school but feel like you are losing your faith, right? And just wondering for them what that means and getting them to explain it to me so that I don't kind of put my own assumptions there. The last one is the skills. And this one's a little bit trickier because there's no one right way of going about this. In fact, there's no established way at all for how to do this. And so it's mostly finding something that works perhaps with just the evidence that we have, that we've been given from our clients on an individual basis, and being able to do some of those core values of things that tend to be helpful that way. So I thought I'd give just a couple examples of students that I've worked with or clients that I've worked with. And I'm not going to necessarily answer kind of what I've done, although I'm happy to do that in the Q&A portion as well. But I want you to understand kind of where these three areas of awareness, knowledge, and skill might come into play. So for the first client that I'm going to describe, it was a male who was about 25 years old, cisgender, single, Mexican-American. He tended to be fairly charismatic, very naturally, and in fact, he was often put into leadership positions, whether that was in his church, which he was a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, or whether that was through his employment. Just kind of one of those people that could get things done and very great leader that way. He also identified as gay, and this was a newer development for him, where he was finally now considering this or adopting it as a label, something that he had not done for a number of years, even though he had the feelings there all along. But he grew up in a culture where he knew that he was going to grow up, serve a mission for his church, and get married to a female, and then have several children and just be happy, right? This is the life for him. And the fact that he was coming to terms with being gay was actually quite distressing to him. Thinking, no, this disrupts my plan, I don't like this one bit. So I guess with that context, I want you to just be thinking, what are the automatic biases that you have here? What pops up for you? Is it this question of like, oh man, like he should really do this, right? Just noticing kind of the initial reaction. The second one, I want you to be thinking like, what questions would you have for him that would help in a practice? Would you automatically assume it's coming in as an expert and be like, well, here's really what I'm seeing going on for you? Or is it asking him, what do you want and how can I help with that? Even if it maybe conflicts with my own values, or I wouldn't make that same choice. And the last one is, how would you do that? How would you approach those with him? He ultimately decided to continue his membership in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And he's still figuring out how to merge that with his sexual identity. As of right now, he has plans of only dating women and not really considering anything other than that at the moment, other than perhaps celibacy, which may or may not fit with other people's values. The second one I'm going to talk about was a 24-year-old cisgender married white male who went through a considerable faith transition a year prior to me seeing him, which disrupted his relationship quite a bit. His wife was still a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. He now considered himself atheist, which caused some tension because within the church, it's often considered like both people to be members of the church, so they get married in the temple, which is viewed as kind of an eternal sort of sealing, an eternal marriage, which is extremely important, those of the faith. And so now his wife is wondering, like, what's going to happen for us in the afterlife? Will I still be with my husband? Will I still be with my family? What's going to happen if we have children together now? So brought up all sorts of questions, contentions, for which they sought therapy, which was helpful in terms of couples therapy. He was now coming in specifically for this emptiness that he felt after his transition. He thought things were good with his wife, although some pressure from in-laws still. But his question was, how do I live a good life now? I feel like my plan or everything I've had that made me happy is now void. My social connections, friends that I've made, some people have stuck with me, others have left. My wife is still with me, but there's still some tension. My in-laws are giving me pressure to stay within the church. And then also just on a more personal level for him, he was figuring out his beliefs, totally reconstructing everything that he had thought and accepted as true, which left him feeling naturally quite empty and alone. And so for him, rather than, again, kind of assuming that I know his experience, it became a question of like, let's figure out your values. Let's find out what's going to be most important and help you live this good life that you want to live. And so he ultimately had left the church, although remained at BYU, which brings up other questions. And so I want you to think about this awareness piece, again, some of the biases that come up, some of the knowledge that you'd want to ask him, the questions you want to know from him, and then the way in which you would approach that. So I mentioned at the beginning, just some scenarios to get you thinking about how to approach this in therapy, although hopefully within this lens of us stepping back as experts, perhaps, or being the best form of expert, which means asking and seeking knowledge from others, holding our own assumptions and biases, putting them on pause, and fully understanding one person's experience as we work with them in therapy. So those are some of my remarks for today.
Thank you so much. So we're going to move now to a structured discussion with the panel, and then we will have half an hour at the end for questions and answers. The first two questions I would like to pair together for the panel. So the first one is, what are current methods of identifying harm in NRMs? And this is the operative question, how can they be improved? And the follow-up question is, when should practices in NRMs be labeled as abuse? When do things like dishwashing reach the level of abuse?
Can I start? When should practices in NRMs be labeled as abuse? Well, again, I don't want to keep harping on it as an outsider, but I do have an insight, and maybe when they shouldn't be labeled as abuse. And it struck me, I've made this point briefly, so many NRMs seem to be defined or constructed around self-actualization or personal growth or psychological attainment or health regimens. It's long struck me that the marginality, I use that in a kind of sociological sense, the marginality of medical and health teachings of certain groups and certain teachers can end up being unwittingly another impetus for the agencies of social control to come down on NRMs and come down on people and come down on leaders. And people that perhaps don't know anything about the regimens or about the groups or about the teachings will see something that is outside the norm as far as medically or in terms of nutrition or psychology, and use that as an excuse to persecute folks. And this can happen, by persecute, I mean legally persecute people. And so, there's an entire discourse outside of this topic and what goes on at this meeting and this professional organization about alternative healing, alternative medicine. If one went to the family medicine meetings or the AMA meetings or the specialty meetings in medicine, there's all kinds of discourse on this topic outside of the context of NRMs, but it's kind of the same discussion. It kind of ends up being the same discussion. And so I think there's another layer for the NRM discussion, and that's the animosity toward, as a result of lack of knowledge about alternative healing, alternative medicine. And so as if it's not bad enough to be a member of a group that has heterodox beliefs about cosmology and about the world and about salvation and about all things religious, there may or may not be things relating to the physical body and human physiology and how to get well and why we're sick that just antagonize an entirely different group of people, namely the medical profession and the moral entrepreneurs that are policing the medical community. And there are groups, I'm sure people at this group familiar with the group Psychop, that's the kind of the organization of skeptics and demuckers that police religious cults and dangerous religions. Well, there's kind of an offshoot of that. I don't know if they still exist actually, called National Council Against Health Fraud, which is kind of like the medical version of PsyCop. And they're very active, and they're always out there debunking everything that doesn't fit. You know, I was debunked by them 30 years ago. It was a badge of honor. You know, it's like, what took them so long? But I mean, now those sorts of groups can begin to weigh in on it. So maybe it's bad enough that people are weighing in on NRMs, and judges and lawyers that don't know anything about the topic, but then you've got medical people weighing in that are like even one level removed. Their level of lack of information is even additional level removed. And so, again, when should things be labeled abuse? Well, what I can say, again, I'll punt on that question, but I think that the medical community, the clinical community, you know, certainly the non-psychiatric community needs to really just lay off. I don't see much good coming from that community of professionals weighing in on this issue when they simply have no professional expertise.
I'm really glad that you brought up this topic, Jeff. I actually teach a class called Spirituality and Healthcare at the University of Florida, and we explore sort of the intersection between alternative medicine and spirituality and medical care. I've been very interested to note that the dialogue around abuse has certainly crept in. We know that in yoga groups, for example, there are, of course, well-documented cases of sexual abuse by leaders, but there are also people, and a particular one well-known outspoken opponent of it's basically claimed that his back was hurt during a yoga class, and he had sort of long-standing health issues from it, and therefore he's calling out this particular style of yoga for its abuse. I have issues with that because I actually practice that particular style of yoga, which is Iyengar yoga, and it's been very helpful to me from a health perspective. So I think it would be very tragic and sad if that brand of yoga were to somehow disappear through lawsuits, and so then all the people like me who are getting benefit from it or who are contributing to it, all the teachers who were working hard, and I think that's what often gets lost is that you know, when you have this punitive climate around abuse, it's all or nothing, right? The group has to either disappear or go away. You know, obviously this person had an injury. The medical, you know, unfortunately our healthcare system isn't so great at, you know, providing people to take care of people's health. So I would think we could find a middle ground. There have obviously been people injured in extreme practices. Some people have died in sweat lodges, for example. And so NRMs are sort of at the fringe of experimentation, but yet we know that many effective practices that are actually sanctioned and paid for by insurance started out at the fringe. And so I think as a society, we would all be poorer if we just limited everything to something that's evidence-based and has been well studied, because we know that studies often can't be conducted without money. Money's not available unless there's something to be packaged and sold. And so, you know, it's nice that we have the National Institutes of Health is now actually has an office that studies alternative medical practices. But again, they're constantly changing. There's all this churn at the margins. And so I think it would be nice for the benefit of everyone who enjoys these therapies and practices if we could find some way to lower the stakes and to stop this sort of dialogue creep that tries to label everything as somehow kind of intentional abuse.
I just want to jump in and say a word about practice with children, because identifying abuse is much more complicated, of course, when you're talking about children who are unlikely to raise their hand and say, hey, I'm being abused. So I do want to say that this is always a complicated and difficult and painful process when child protection needs to become involved with a family, even in the most ideal circumstances. And that hopefully, and the expectation is that child protection workers are working to the standard of the state or province that they live in, who have well-defined definitions of what constitutes abuse. What can become more complicated is if a worker is coming in with preconceived biases about the religious group that the child belongs to, and so is unable to work therapeutically and relationally with that family. Susan brought up a point about access. It's often perceived that children in NRMs are difficult to work with, or it's difficult to have access to these families. I can tell you from my practice experience, no one has ever opened the door and said, oh good, the social worker is here. Like, access is always a challenge. And as the professional, it's your job to figure out how to work well, how to care well, and how to work wisely. And this often involves a lot of time and a lot of practice and some knowledge and religious literacy if you're working with someone who comes from a specific religious group. So I think we need to apply the standards that we already have to all children and families while bringing in an intersectional lens that looks at the social context. For example, poverty. I can't recall working with a family where poverty was not the primary issue that they were facing. So, thank you.
I'd like to say something about child labor. I've been studying the 12 tribes for, 2 decades or something. And recently they've been accused of, exploiting their children, making them work in the fields or do housework or in their industries, like making candles. And on the other hand, the Amish, there was this big case where the Amish were given permission for their teenagers to stay home and help with the harvest, not go to school, because, the point was that it was partly the culture wouldn't survive, that the family values of working together on the farm were an important part of their religious life, and of course, their economic life, getting the crops in. So basically we don't find the same kind of respect for the alternative cultures of new religions that we do for, say, indigenous people, though I guess Jessica would, we could argue about that. But, or, the older sects like the Amish. And so, and of course, when you talk to the elders, inside the groups, like when I talk to the elders of the 12 tribes, they say, well, look at the children today. What do? They sit around playing with their video games, going on the internet, seeing horrible things. I mean, this is abuse. They spend hours and hours doing this stuff. And so when you look at a little child working in the field, planting flowers or seeds and doing the dishes, singing a hymn, you think, well, how much more wholesome, So, basically, there isn't much, they're throwing around these allegations without bothering to look at the culture, the whole culture, and how this fits in, and give it a kind of respect as an alternative way of life.
Yeah, I'll just chime in. This is a really profound issue, and as I'm thinking through it, I can't find any one way of answering this question. So I'm just going to speak from a practitioner perspective and say when I think of abuse, I actually am less concerned about using that as the legal term, unless I really have to do something to, report their abuse or make sure that they're taken care of. I guess I'm more concerned about just the harm that's caused. And with harm, I'm less concerned about whether there's something factual there as I am just the perception from my client. And so even if I maybe don't view that as abuse, if they're going to use that terminology, I would probably just go with it and describe more their experience rather than be concerned about giving it a discrete label that way. So again, I don't know if that really helps with the issue very much. I'm just thinking more of like what I'm most concerned about would be the well-being of the person I'm working with, and how can I help them with the way that they're perceiving things.
So if I could just tie together some threads there that I heard across those comments, it sounded like the biggest one was simply a lack of expertise, right? We have social workers who are not trained in religious literacy. We have people making claims about alternative health practices who do not have sufficient background in those practices. The other trend is using a hatchet when a scalpel is required. I think a really profound example of that is trying to stop abuse with a paramilitary raid as we saw in 2008. And I think the stickiest issue here is, to what extent is abuse something objective, and to what extent is it something subjective? I think that may be the toughest issue that's come along. Would anyone like to say anything further on this one, or I can pose another question to the panel?
I had one brief follow-up comment I wanted to make. I think that part of the cult stereotype is that cultic groups are secretive and they do not open up. And I think Jessica has sort of addressed the whole question of, what makes people want to open up or be more transparent. And I do think, again, that's going to be reducing tensions rather than heightening them through legal and governmental action. But many scholars have spoken written eloquently about the whole problem of the stereotype of the secretive group, and you can see this again on shows like I think it's called The Following, where they'll kill people, rather than tell the truth. And I think what the public perhaps should know is that everyone has, or should be aware of, is everyone has sort of multiple layers of loyalties in their lives, regardless of whether they're brainwashed or not. And to the extent that they think that their family is going to suffer, they're going to be less likely to talk about real issues that need to be resolved. And, in the cases where we've seen reform happen, it's usually when people in the group themselves are given more agency and power and actually are able to hold the leaders to account. And it's possible that there are things that could be done that could make that more likely to happen.
Well, the other thing I'd like to mention is I think journalists to a great extent are responsible for, spreading that stereotype that new religions are secretive and won't talk to the outside. And I've known several cases where a journalist has written in their article, I made, phone calls asking for comment, they refused to speak to me. And then I've spoken to the group itself, and they said, well, we were trying to reach him. They have a special little, mission to talk to the media. We're sitting here waiting in our median home, and nobody called. And I've also heard journalists and anti-cultists say, what's the point in talking to the group? They always lie. In fact, when I came out with my book on the Raelians, Aliens Adored, I'd spent 15 years, going to their meetings with my students and doing interviews and having fun, studying them. And then, I'm on this TV program, and the first question from the host is, why would you, I understand that you actually, went to meetings and talked to the Raelians. Why would you do this? You know that they're liars. What? And then at the same time, I realized at the same time that there's this book that had come out of these two journalists who'd gone into a Raelian summer workshop undercover, and they had been going around the tents recording people, and they wrote this really stupid article saying, we didn't see any cloned babies, therefore it was a hoax. Yeah, you don't see cloned babies walking around, so it must be a hoax, So, and, so their book was very much, lionized, and because they got the truth, they just went in for one weekend and spied, did covert research, and they were the big heroes, whereas I'd spent 15 years studying the group, and I was sort of like, oh, well, she's just one of these stupid sociologists who, cult apologists, So anyway, I'm just saying that, that I think journalists are responsible for spreading this idea that new religions won't talk to you. Because in my experience, most of them will. Like a few of them, told me to buzz off, but nearly all of them, they love someone who'll come in and listen to their stories.
So this is actually a good segue into our next question, which is how can we promote greater accountability and transparency? And I assume that this question is aimed mostly at the NRMs themselves, but we could also think about extending this to other institutions such as the media or social workers who maybe don't want to share maybe gaps in their knowledge and similar issues like this. So the question is, how can we promote greater accountability and transparency?
I'll say so. I don't know if this is the context that this question was asked, but if groups would be willing to be open to study and documentation that might help. I mean, that's a lot to ask since there's such a difficult relationship between some groups on the basis of their perceived marginality and people trying to come in from the outside and write about them and talk to them. But I mean, you know, mainline religious groups promote historical scholarship and scholarship about, you know, just in-house church history, you could say. I think if groups would be more amenable to being observed or being sharing their story, their narrative, maybe that would help. The flip side of that, I recognize, is that outsiders have I think, done great harm to a lot of people and to a lot of groups, and there could be maybe a sense of leave us alone. And I think there's probably a lot of this going on. I mean, we've been hearing, you know, from kind of one side of the argument here, but if groups close themselves off, perhaps for good reason, maybe that helps fuel some of the response. Maybe that helps fuel some of the antagonism. And again, it may be a good thing to close oneself off. But I think it's sometimes something done for the right reason can feel responsible. This is, okay, I'm going to go off because a complete tangent. You know, my normal hat, I'm an epidemiologist, and my normal research has nothing to do with this, but for the last 2 years I've been writing about COVID and the SARS-CoV-2 virus and doing interviews. And I think about last summer, the lockdown for a month and a half. Tactically, I understood that. I think that was the right thing to do. We needed to do that to prevent transmission. Strategically, I think it was a calamity because what it did, it fueled this reaction. And I think we wouldn't have had the vaccine, again, off topic, we wouldn't have had the vaccine resistance and a lot of the stuff that we're experiencing now if we hadn't had this reaction to what was done last summer. I completely understood what we did last summer, and it was necessary, but it provoked a reaction. So now back to this topic. I think if groups are secretive, do close themselves off, do cloister themselves, in a way it's not surprising that the mainstream, which really doesn't know, you know what, from Shinola about any of these groups, are going to develop all sorts of paranoid ideations and delusions. And again, my phrase, immoral entrepreneurs are going to come out of the woodwork and want to, you know, go to town. And it's just an unfortunate situation. But it's kind of how, I think it's kind of how things are. People want to poke their face into stuff, especially if they can make hay. People that, you know, prosecutors, for example, or judges that want to be known as hanging judges and standing up for what's right and, you know, protecting people. Maybe NRMs make easy targets because generally compared to the outside power structure that maybe are powerless, they don't have the same political clout, and it's real easy to make hay. You know, look at the Branch Davidians, a small group of people going about their stuff, and, you know, SWAT isn't even the right word, what went on there. And then in the end result, people were incinerated. And did anyone really pay a price? I mean, in the long term? Not really.
I think it's unrealistic to expect new religions to be transparent. I think it's quite normal, and actually what's fun and interesting about studying these groups is they have secret doctrines. They have different levels of knowledge, and you have to earn their trust. You have to, or if you're a member, you have to be initiated, you know, into several levels before you can access the, you know, the real stuff. They have this expression, I think it's the children of God, you know, there's milk for the lambs and meat for the adults or something, you know. So you don't expect, when you first talk to a member from a new religion, you don't expect them to blurt out the most controversial, weird aspects of their faith, you know, when they first meet you. And that doesn't mean they're secretive or deceptive. The other thing is you can, as a researcher, from a researcher's point of view, you can find out a lot of secret stuff by talking to ex-members. And so I think it's really important to practice what they call triangulation. You know, you talk to the current members, the leaders who will give you the best possible, like, when people come to my house, I pretend I'm a good housekeeper by hearing, like, so they don't realize that place is usually a mess. It's the same thing when you visit new religions. So they'll give me the most, they'll make it sound pretty bland and compatible with, mainstream ideas. But then you'll talk to an ex-member and they'll tell you the real story, what the real doctrine is or real practices. And the trick or the challenge is somehow juggling your relationship with these two parties, because if the current members find out you've been talking to ex-members, they might cut off access, and ex-members might be mad because they think you're going to report what they said to the, so it's, you have to be a diplomat. And you also have to time. At what point will you, I shouldn't actually be speaking. I'm scared now I've just given away my method. Anyway. So you've got to kind of time when you're going to speak to the ex-members. So I think what's really needed here, there's a tendency for journalists to exaggerate or distort, secret doctrines or slightly controversial doctrines, or make them sound repulsive and weirder than they really are if you understand them in context. So it's important to have world translators, people who, like Gordon Melton, here, or me, or so people who will try to explain to the public what these people believe in context, and they'll trust you because you're not a member, and you can cross that bridge. You can make, cross bridges here, or mend bridges. What is it? What's the word? Yeah.
Mend fences.
Mend fences.
Build bridges.
Build bridges. Thank you. Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
I just don't think we should leave out the fact that many groups, new religious movements, therapy groups, are deeply engaged with the whole question of how can we improve ourselves. And we've seen a lot of this, for example, in American Buddhism. People realize that they've transplanted practices out of the East into the West that are cut off from their original ethical foundations. And there's been a lot of experimentation, and people have been hurt and injured. There's also been a fair amount of rebuilding and reconstruction and flattening of hierarchies and dynamism within the groups. And I think that it would be just wonderful if we could see more, again, sort of bridge building rather than accusation, blame, and lawsuits. I think it would improve life for all the communities involved.
Yeah, just to wrap this up, I mean, all organizations engage in impression management. They want to be seen well by outsiders. Kathy Wessinger wrote about it. As NRM scholars, we're not in the business of either identifying a group as a destructive cult or giving it a clean bill of health. So maybe to tweak this question slightly, I mean, we're never going to have, omniscience about what goes on within an NRM, but it seems like what we can do is promote issues of trust, bridge building. I heard the term therapeutic alliance, and I think we can certainly agree that doing things like a paramilitary raid is very, very bad for the therapeutic alliance. So there might be ways to kind of elicit trust that would help to open things up, even though these sort of questions of what can we really know will probably never be resolved. We have another question, which is what are appropriate therapeutic approaches for current or former members of NRMs?
Wow, I guess that one's going to be me. Speaking to some of my points earlier, is I don't think there's any one correct way. In fact, as a clinician, I would never hope that someone would come in to me and say, oh, hey, you need to do a different form of therapy just for this specific sort of client, especially if it's the one that I'm not practiced in or not skilled in or knowledgeable about. So the best way that I can find it is kind of describing this fit of using it kind of religious beliefs or value systems as a multicultural variable or factor. So just as we would describe any number of demographics as something that we would take into context as one piece of what defines a person, that we would use kind of the same similar approach, but just keeping that with sensitivity. So again, I don't know how articulate or eloquent this answer really is to describe, other than just viewing it as a piece of someone and asking good questions that way. Maybe this is something we can have further discussion on later. But I'd love to hear other opinions or ideas of that.
Thanks. I agree with that. I particularly like the framing it as having multicultural competencies. I've written elsewhere about what a strengths-based approach to working with, especially people who were raised in and then left NRMs, might look like, to contrast what I see as the deficit-based approach that's generally taken in therapeutic and sort of social work angles. I've written elsewhere about what I call alternative religion kids, which is similar to the idea of third culture kids. Some people may be aware of this, but if you treat them not as children or young people who are coming to you with some kind of deficit, but that they have come from an alternative spiritual or religious culture, and bring a curiosity to that can often be very helpful. I think helpers broadly need to recognize that there's a diversity of NRM experiences and not go in thinking that they know the story before the client has told it. In my own experience of seeing various therapists over the years, there was one in particular I can remember, having like my first or second session with her, and then she came back and I could tell that she had read some kind of information about cults because her perspective on me changed. And the big thing that changed, like I said, was it was like she knew my story before I had told it. She knew where the harm was, and she knew sort of where I should be ending up and how I should feel in the end. And what we really want to bring is an approach that the client is the expert on their own life, and that change comes from real listening for understanding. This is a sort of across-the-board therapeutic expectation, I would say. And that applies just as much to someone from a religious group that is unpopular or that seems strange to you as it does anywhere else. I think we need to look for ways to work with clients to build reflexive identity. The people who have written about this are Dominic Coates and John Paul Healy. They're both therapists and scholars in Australia who've done wonderful work with people from NRMs. They don't often, but because their literature is in the therapeutic literature, they're often not taken up by religious studies scholars, but I totally think they should be. Coates particularly has noted that people who, in her case, she was studying those who joined and left NRMs, often come out with a greater sense of self-awareness, that their experiences are complex and multifaceted, and that it can be used as, their experience can be seen as a healing tool in their life, and you really have to listen to what that experience meant for that person. So I think that's the key, really.
Final question, or final structured question anyway, is how can the therapeutic community interact with NRM scholars to create better resources? So what would be some concrete things that we could do to have better therapists?
This is a great question, actually. I'll try to answer it from my perspective. I think that this will require some professional humility on the part of all the parties involved to be able to recognize that each party brings something unique to the table. It's something unique to the conversation, and that no one group of scholars or practitioners can do this alone. I'm a big advocate in professional settings, especially when the topics are new or controversial or fields are emerging, to getting diverse groups of people from diverse backgrounds around a table, literally around the table. And I'll give you two professional examples from my life, professional communities that I'm part of. One group that I think has done a lousy job of this, and one group that's done a great job. So back in the 1990s, when the whole alternative medicine field it's always been there, but was coalescing at the NIH and elsewhere, I was always advocating, let's bring people together, doctors, chiropractors, energy healers, biostatisticians, get them around the table and figure out how should we be researching this, how should we be doing this. This never happened. And so now, integrative medicine is a thing, it's popular, but it's still marginal within academic medicine. And if people deny it, they have their head in the sand. It's just never broken through that marginality because we haven't been able to get people from diverse perspectives together. The other example would be the community of researchers, and this that I'm familiar with, that have researched religion and spirituality and faith and physical and mental health. A field qua field that dates back to probably the mid 80s, late 80s. For well over 30 years, there's kind of a group of us, we're almost like the A-team. We're the core group of people that have been at this since day one, and now there's many more people. Sociologists, psychologists, doctors of different specialties, epidemiologists, statisticians, gerontologists, I'm leaving people out. And we've all been at meetings with each other, we've all been at committees with each other, and we've written white papers and reports together, we've been very welcoming of second and third generation of scholars. As a result, this is a subject now, it's a topic, there's books, there's meetings, there's professional societies. Maybe to some people it's marginal, but certainly within sociology and psychology and academic medicine, it's not really that marginal. Every medical school has coursework on this. So both of these topics originally were a little bit off the beaten path. One group embraced multiple disciplinary conversation, ongoing work, agreeing on practice standards and research questions and all sorts of things. The other group didn't. One group has flourished and entered the mainstream of conversation. The other one remains marginal. So maybe that can be applied here. And maybe aside from NRM scholars and members of the therapeutic community, maybe there are other voices or other people involved that can be part of this conversation, including members themselves, including people themselves who have been members of groups and grown up in groups and have that kind of emic understanding that perhaps outside experts, even if they're NRM scholars, could still potentially be outsiders. I would think, how can we bring as many voices, as many different classes of people in this conversation as possible? And I encourage people to just think outside the box on that. Even lawyers and judges, bring everybody in on the conversation.
Whoa, Jeff.
The good lawyers and judges. There's a few of those.
I would just like to not leave this discussion without at least mentioning that we've talked a little bit about worldview translation, and there are some good resources out there for people who are interested. Of course, the World Religions and Spirituality Project, I think it's World, WRLDRELS.
WRSP.
P, okay,
WRSP.
SP, yeah, I always forget. Anyway, World Religion and Spirituality Project has very good, detailed, peer-reviewed articles on a wide variety of groups. That's David Bromley's project. And there's also Inform, which is based in the UK, which has a good, solid information about many groups. And so those are two. And I would just like to say, and I'm very grateful to Jeff.
Gordon Melton's.
I'm so sorry. And Gordon Melton's Encyclopedia of American Religions obviously is
His
the...
Santa Barbara Institute, his library.
So there's a large library at the University of California, Santa Barbara that was curated by Gordon Melton, and that's also a wonderful resource for researchers. And I'm hoping that Gordon will also be weighing in on ideas. And I just hope that this panel can be the beginning of some kind of new approach, and I'm hoping that people from other disciplines will perhaps see this video and hear about our efforts and want to participate. I'd love to see this turn into some kind of handbook, manual, edited volume. We'd love to have participation of more senior scholars in new religious movements as well. And so that's the final word I wanted to say on that topic.
Thinking about this, it seems to me the biggest problem is not that there are not good resources available about these groups. The problem is what David Feltmate called ignorant familiarity. A lot of people with a lot of power feel they already know everything that there is to know about these groups. And the term that I think is more useful for talking about this now is the Dunning-Kruger effect. Audience, that's what's called, the Dunning-Kruger effect? But basically, yeah, the less that you know about something, the more confident you feel about it. So this is a huge problem, right? How do you get people to think, actually, I don't know anything about this group or their beliefs. And not only that, I don't know where to look for resources if I wanted to know more about it. And the other problem, I was really struck by Susan Palmer's story about doing ethnography with the group for 15 years and having people say, well, no, you're a cult apologist, we're going to go with this shoddy undercover journalism instead, this is a real problem, right? The American Academy of Religion just released their guidelines of sort of the definition of religious literacy, and one of those guidelines was you have to be able to tell a good source from a bad source, right? You have to be able to tell what's a good source of information, and we cannot do that. I mean, this is the problem in the field of new religious movements, right? Are you going to listen to Rick Ross or someone like Susan Palmer, right? And on what criteria do you base those things? So I don't know how to fix this, but this seems to be the core issue before we can do things like provide resources for social workers about how to maintain the therapeutic alliance.
Well, one thing I think one thing I've noticed is that when psychologists write about cults, they tend to accept the brainwashing theory, whereas when sociologists write about cults, they tend to challenge it, and they have respect for conversion. They see these, affiliation as genuine conversion. There are some notable exceptions, of course, like Dick Anthony, who's a psychologist who actually attacks the brainwashing theory, and a few others. But I think for therapists to get together, psychologists and sociologists, there's got to be some, I guess, agreement about brainwashing, and some respect, some idea that these groups might have some real spiritual, a kernel of real spiritual knowledge that's worth investigating.
Well, if I could just follow up on that briefly, that's why I was so excited about this idea of encouraging therapists to look at people who speak against the brainwashing narrative, because this stood out to me when I was watching the HBO series The Vow, where you had many of these people who, clearly had suffered trauma in the group, but they also were very conflicted because they said this group was the best thing that ever happened to them. It helped them to overcome their emotional hang-ups. They were much more confident people, and so they're speaking against the narrative right in this documentary that's been created to try to reinforce the narrative, and nobody seems to be pointing out this, what you might call this great cognitive dissonance.
Yeah, so I guess I would like to think about in an ideal world, if you were in the helping professions and you thought, I think this person might have been brainwashed, or they might be under coercive control, or any of these other sorts of names for this, where could I go for resources to kind of think about that question? What resources could they use, and more importantly, how would we get them to know about those resources? Because I think a lot of people with not very good information would be willing to rush in and tell them all about brainwashing.
If I could just jump in, I don't think that there are tons of really good resources, and I think that's why this conversation is so important. I'm always interested when someone uses a term like brainwashing. I'm not going to the dictionary. I want to know what that means in their life, right? What purpose is that serving? Usually it has something to do with feeling that they were manipulated or misled or deeply harmed, and that's important. But in terms of resources, I think this is just the beginning, I'm hoping, of developing some good resources and some good practice standards.
Gordon Melton from Baylor University. Just a quick comment on resources. Becky Moore has built quite a good collection of material at San Diego State University. And the last issue of Chesner's journal was a very lengthy bibliography of ex-member apostasy accounts. We were quite surprised at how much literature we found that was out there. Well over half of it was privately published. So it's if you don't know about it, you don't know about it. The cult studies people do not keep up with that literature, as important as it seems to be to them. So I just had a couple of observations I'd like to make about the subject matter and offer and invite your comments. Number one, we have to remember that of the 700-800 new religions, depending upon your definition, in America, the great majority of them have never had an accusation of abuse thrown at them, have never been studied, have never been written about. There is not so much as an article about them, not even a journalistic one. So that to make comments about all new religions is BS. We don't, even as new religion scholars, we couldn't even name most of these groups. We are not aware of their existence unless something happens that brings them to the news before us. And so we must be very careful about that. Secondly, in the doing abuse, the point of that, of course, is that most new religions have no history of abuse. And there is no reason to suggest that new religions are particularly abusive. That would lead to the second point, that in doing our studies on abuse in new religions, they always need to be comparative. How does abuse in new religions relate to abuse in mainline churches, which has quite a record of abuse, in sectarian groups, pastor of the Rock Church in Virginia, 20,000 member church, was just arrested for soliciting minor in a sting operation. Very embarrassing to the Pentecostal community. And that's not the first case. So we need to put this in the context of abuse straight across the boards of all kinds. And thirdly, and I'm drawing upon an incident with a group just north of us in Laycock, Homestead Heritage. How do we distinguish between abuse of a group and abusive people who join groups and are abusive while members of the group, but not because of the group? We had 4 cases in the Homestead Heritage group of people who were marginal to the group and where the abuse had occurred before they had become members of the group. But when the abuse was reported to the police, the group was blamed for the abuse. So we have those kind of cases to deal with as well. Thank you.
Thanks, Gordon.
Hello, I'm Holly Folk from Western Washington University. This is a topic that is very relevant to my own work right now. For the past year, I've been doing some work in behalf of the Jehovah's Witnesses, specifically reviewing 3, I want to put this in air quotes, studies of their possible institutional abuse of children, specifically sexual abuse. And just as a first comment, I have to say that this was a real eye-opener to me. I did not realize how vicious the anti-cult movement was until I took up this topic. I have jumped off all social media for my own protection. It is, I can talk to you at lunch, it is put hair on my chest, so to speak, in a way that is really sort of troubling, and I would invite everybody to be just very, very cautious if you continue to work on this topic. You need to be prepared for a very high level of harassment. I have a treatise, and I'll try to sort of keep myself succinct, but starting with Gordon's statement of needing to separate out institutional abuse from people who might be participants in a religious organization, but where the organization is not causal. My own findings with the Jehovah's Witnesses is they seem to have a rate of family sexual abuse that is commensurate with rates in secular society. But there is 0 evidence of them committing anything similar to institutional abuse, similar to the Catholic Church. And my own statement about commensurate actually is only conjecture. I've never seen anything to suggest that they have an outsized rate of abuse. And it's very, very troubling to realize that there's an international movement to portray them as systematic abusers. I want to remind us people of a couple of things. The 1995, I think it was, statement on coercion, which a number of religious studies scholars weighed in on, where there was clear agreement that physical harm in groups was a problem, but the policy statement, and I think this was through the SSSR, broke down with disagreement about psychological intimidation. And so I think that if people are going to try to evaluate or to establish standards, this is going to become very, very messy, because responsible people in different fields are going to have different levels of abuse, different definitions of abuse. And also, we have to realize that different locations will have different definitions of abuse as well. So on the one hand, corporal punishment is illegal in many countries. On the other hand, corporal punishment is used in the public school systems in many states in the United States. And we should also realize that in different states, the age at which children can opt out of religion also varies. And so in the state of Washington, once a child is 12, if a child says, ha ha, I'm never going to church again, and the parent tries to coerce the child, that is child abuse. In a lot of other situations in a lot of other states, telling a 13-year-old, no, you have to go to church on Christmas with your grandmother is not considered psychological harm. So I think it's going to be a very ambitious task to try to develop a consensus on anything like standards. I do see abuse as very endemic in society. I am sure it probably exists in some new religious movements. I know for a fact from my own family experience, I am myself a survivor of abuse, that it exists in secular families and also in families who participate in mainstream religions. And I feel that needs to be discussed much more often than it is. Just a couple of other things to sort of note. The sincere beliefs of some religious groups are sometimes not helpful to their own portrayal. And this is sort of a sad irony. I think about the 12 tribes who published a book entitled When the Spanking Stops, and I think that that really clearly did not help their case. And I also want to pick up on a statement that Ron Numbers gave to me. He was commenting a number of years ago, and I think that we can apply this to new religious movements and also to secular groups as well, secular people. And that is that parents have a tendency to sort of enact their visions upon their children. And we need to not think about this as something that's simply within new religious movements, but to realize that families who have strong beliefs about vegetarianism might want to raise their children vegan. Some families might have certain notions in terms of health. Do you vaccinate? Do you not vaccinate? We live in a society where, at least for now, the Supreme Court has said parents have the right to raise their children according to cultural beliefs. But I also am open to the idea that in groups that have beliefs that depart from mainstream, white, middle-class, secular society are sometimes deemed abusive simply on the virtue of cultural difference. Building on that as well, I think it's also important to realize that some new religions are themselves culture-bound, and the conduct may not be rooted in anything pertaining to the religion, but pertaining to the society. I'm Hungarian American. Hungarians are known for having very, very strong corporal punishment. If you're a Hasidic group coming out of Hungarian society and you beat your children, that is unfortunate, but unfortunately it's also something that I don't see as pertaining to Hasidism. I think it is something that is very endemic in Eastern European culture in general. And then I think that that's almost everything I was going to say. I wanted to just also raise one other item that I thought was sort of interesting, and that is the sort of cultural portrayal of what is abuse or not. I remember at one point I read an essay about, I think this is in Nordhoff or Heinz, about the Oneida community. And at one point the Oneida community decided that they didn't want to have to feed their children more than once a day because it was inconvenient. And so they strapped their children into high chairs, and they sat there, and they gave their children multiple courses of food, oatmeal, bread, stewed fruit, applesauce, milk, but they only got one meal a day. And I'm hoping that maybe they got a cookie or a glass of milk on some other time, but basically they got to the point where they said, babies only need to eat once a day. And this was considered not abusive. This was reported in the publications about Oneida. It was never presented as a problem. Myself, I react with real horror. And so I think as well, we need to sort of realize that their culture and cultural context and the reception of the group very much matters with whether or not something is portrayed as abusive. I have a lot of other things I can say, but I'll pick it up with lunch. So thank you.
This isn't really a response, but I mean, it's just kind of a reiteration of what I said, that, the old expression, one man's meat's another man's poison, and who's doing the judging here? It's very easy to look down at something that we don't understand and we don't know about and say, that's this is bad, cult equals bad, and hopefully we aren't guilty of that. But I guess the question is, how do we instill more open-mindedness in people that aren't scholars of this? That's a $64,000 question. But I think unless and until we can do that, this problem's going to persist. There will continue to be this issue. Yes.
Oh, I know the last thing I was going to say. I'm very depressed in the level of public illiteracy about new religious movements right now. And I find that the over-the-top use of entertainment media and the focus on cults in popular culture, I think, is profoundly unhelpful. And I think, along with the idea of developing trust with new and controversial religions, I think it would be very helpful if our profession were a little bit more assertive against the media and pop culture portrayals to let people know that, to quote a Zen phrase, they are mistaking the reflection of the moon for the moon, and these are really entertainment stereotypes, not rooted in fact, but rooted in fantasy. I think when I think about my own students, it's very, very hard right now to dislodge their assumptions about what a cult is. They think it's a thing. I can spend an entire semester communicating to them the problems with these assumptions, and at the end of the day, I realize I have not moved the needle whatsoever. And so one of the things I would encourage this community of scholars to do is to be much more pointed, to communicate to people that what they watch on Netflix is qualitatively different than how people actually live their lives.
Erin, did you have a response as well?
Oh. I just wanted to pick up on Holly. I'm glad you used that term, culture bound, and I think it's important for the public to understand that NRMs, because they're small and they're rapidly changing, are often also undergoing cultural transformation, especially if they're transplanted from one culture into another. And I think that as someone who grew up in a new religious movement and who generally appreciated my upbringing, I would say that there were times when I felt that I wish that there could have been a sort of other options available to me as far as education or ideas that I might have been exposed to. And I think that, perhaps Jessica or Brett can speak to this a little bit as well, as far as, I know that there are movements to promote, and the AAR has, to promote religious literacy curricula at all levels. And although I don't necessarily believe that government should heavy-handedly interfere in the lives and the parental choices, I also think that it might be nice if there were some kind of required religious literacy at all levels, and including for people who are being brought up within a religious community. I don't know if you have a thought about that.
My only brief response would be that in most sort of counseling or social work programs, religion is not taken up at all. If you're lucky, you'll talk about spirituality in this sort of vague sense, but not religion. So we're just generally not trained to talk about that. It's funny, I can talk with people about sex and their finances, but somehow when religion comes up, people really clam up. It's just going to, I don't have an answer. I'm just noting the deficit there.
Well, I don't know if I have too much to add to that. So my own training, my own graduate training was actually at Brigham Young University, where you think would be the hub of understanding kind of spiritual and religious differences. And honestly, it was rarely talked about. I mean, we would start class with a prayer. We'd have some discussions in which we'd interact, but the training side, it was a little bit more absent, unless me as an individual or a student would purposely seek that out. So certainly it was an open atmosphere, but it wasn't pushed or set in the curriculum.
I've done work, because I had a girlfriend way back in the mid-'80s who permanently lost a kid to a foster care system. And so I've done work. There has been organized opposition to the child welfare system, which is, ironically, it's led by conservatives. Mike Ferris, who's managed to make the SPLC's age group list, which is, in my opinion, a politically correct version of the old Attorney General subversive list. It has no credibility, but he leaves the group. But he worked with progressives, and there's been conservatives have a lot of reasons for disliking the child welfare system. I mean, people with mental health problems are automatically viewed as potentially bad parents, and I think a lot of people, we have not looked at the organized efforts to reform it, which has crossed from progressive to conservative. I was at a very ultra-conservative meeting last month in Ohio, put on by the Parental Rights Foundation. I have a lot of issues with their views on certain issues. I don't agree with Mike Ferris's brand of evangelical Christianity, but I also know that when somebody has their kid ripped from them right after birth because they have a disability and a psychiatric disability, that's painful, and it's painful if you're someone who cares about that person. And we talked about, so there isn't, I don't know if it's dealt much with NRMs, but it has certainly been there. I mean, Mike Ferris got his start defending homeschooling families, and in California, it has been declared by the Court of Appeals that homeschooling is not child neglect, that it is a right of parents to engage in homeschooling. I don't know about other states, in the union, but I know that in California that is the case.
I'm Dan Koch. I am a doctoral counseling psychology student in Kirkland, Washington, and I am relieved to know that I'm not the only one with 7 or 8 things to say, which I will try and pare down. So my area is spiritual abuse, not new religious movements in particular. So that's where I'm coming from. I'm also a practicing or training clinician. I have 10 clients, 5 or so of which identify as recovering from spiritual harm and abuse. I wanted a couple things. First of all, in terms of resources, I have developed a scale. It is not published yet. Hopefully within a year, there will be some sort of scholarly patina on it such that it is could be widely used, but other clinicians in my clinic where I'm an intern are using it and consulting with me. It measures, this gets to the definitional problem. It measures potentially abusive experiences and their common results. And these are, it's from a 3,200 person survey with prompts pulled from the qualitative literature around spiritual abuse. There's only one quantitative study, and it's in the UK by Lisa Oakley and some colleagues of hers. And I wanted to also briefly talk about treatment for this kind of stuff. I'm being trained just in straight up cognitive processing therapy, which is used for all kinds of PTSD. And I'm finding that the basic structure of that work, making an impact statement, looking for stuck points, examining core beliefs, it's super person-centered. You know, this really, a lot of this gets, in terms of working with the clients, it gets to how do people actually change, and the evidence seems very strong that change has to come from within. You know, the best moment with a client is when you've been hoping they'll figure something out and they figure it out on their own. That's how it sticks. That's how it's worked for me as a client, you know, in my own therapy. One other little bit is that there is a group of researchers under the Religious Trauma Institute, and there is like a research collective, a lot of students and a lot of established scholars. And there's a little bit of this war. This battle's being fought there as well. One of the co-founders was the main source in a big, very well-written piece in the New Republic, the biggest thing I've seen on spiritual abuse. And unfortunately, she used the term brainwashing in her interview, and I emailed her about this and recommended against it. I said, I don't think it's academically rigorous. And then maybe more important, from my perspective, it's basically going to cut off access to the groups that are most in need of whatever it is that we are figuring out. You know, when I think of working with denominations, for instance, to reduce spiritual abuse, I don't think about the Episcopal Church and the United Church of Christ. I think about Pentecostals. I think about Southern Baptists. I think about the less regulated, sort of less, pastors who don't go to seminary and don't have pastoral care training. Anyway, again, this is very hard to not just sort of spew a lot. Those aren't questions, but I'm really interested in anything you have to say about any of it. And if anybody would like to be in touch, I would love to get an email address, and I'll send you the current version of the religious abuse scale, spiritual harm and abuse scale. All the terminology is fluid these days.
Okay, I've got a very short question for you. I'm puzzled by this term spiritual abuse because it implies that the immortal soul has been hurt. So it seems to imply a religious,
Yeah.
idea. So
It's a good question. So some people use religious abuse. One of the people on my dissertation committee, Paula Swindle, uses religious abuse. Lisa Oakley from the UK uses spiritual abuse. The way I conceive of it is it's just what's the modifier of the word abuse. And the way that I would define spirituality, it is, someone's attempt to connect with the divine or, the transcendent or whatever. So the question is the abuse religious, or are the consequences of the abuse spiritual? And that you could just sort of go either way. So when I call it spiritual harm and abuse, what I mean is a person's spiritual life, their spirituality, is being harmed by abuse in a religious setting. So if it made sense, like branding wise, I would call it religious or spiritual harm or abuse, but like it becomes a word salad. But in that literature, it's basically 50-50, which route they go.
thank you.
Can I comment first? Just a brief follow-up. It's my work, and I've also read Paula Swindle's work as well. It's my understanding that from the healthcare perspective, that religious abuse is defined as when the religious concepts themselves are weaponized to make the person feel belittled, shamed, or guilty. So, for example, if someone is told that by committing a certain act, they have not only endangered the leader's life, endangered the survival of the community, endangered their own future. And obviously that gets to difficult questions theologically, because many religious traditions do provide that by committing certain acts, people are endangering their souls. But so this is kind of a friction point between religion and psychology, would you say?
Yeah, I mean, there's so much eye of the beholder problems around this. Is spanking abusive? Well, it depends on what you mean. So for the moment, I have tried to sideswipe that by going, here is a scale for clients that identifies potentially abusive events or experiences. They may not identify them as abusive, but you can get a sense. There are 6 subscales. You can get a sense of sort of what they came from. And for me, that just gives me questions to ask them as my client. Like it's not, but you could, and eventually I'd like to get a grant, do a representative population, have some sort of data around at least what people report experiencing. And some of those are very particular things, like being pressured to remain in an abusive marriage or something. Like, I'd want to know how many people think that they have had that experience, even if that's a little bit in the eye of the beholder. It's a very good and sticky thing for sure.
I just had a very brief comment, which is that most practitioners, mental health professionals or therapists, are generalists, and they have a lot of good competencies in helping people. And you don't necessarily need a super specialized approach because someone has come from a strange religious background. I think you can have a lot of faith in your own abilities as a therapist to deal with most things that, most human problems that you'll confront. And that combined with some literacy about religion and literacy about particular groups, I think you're pretty good.
I'm looking at accusations of sexual abuse where there is the possibility of real and lasting harm. And I think you're talking about how people sort of construct their spiritual narrative and how their spiritual beliefs or religious beliefs impact their life decisions. And so I want to say at the outset, I think that these are different entities and I'm responding somewhat differently, but I have to say as a caution, sexual abuse and physical abuse is alive and well in mainstream Protestantism. And I worry a lot that what you just sort of said is an off-the-cuff remark, because this is being taped, might sort of omit the point that in terms of real harm, this is not something that we can assign and simply say, okay, we'll find this in the Pentecostals, or we'll find this in new religious movements or controversial groups. In terms of the real harm that is transpiring, especially to children and also to women, this is something which you can find in the Episcopal Church. I know this personally. In the United Church of Christ, I know this personally. In the Friends General Conference, I know this personally. And so, I mean, I guess this is a place where I lose my own objectivity, because everybody who's ever hurt me and everybody who's ever hurt my family has been a member of a mainstream religion. So I don't know, I mean, that's just sort of a neat response, but I would sort of say that I think that as you continue your work, it's going to be extremely important that you we're talking about people's beliefs, people's feelings, and not to necessarily sort of try to transpose this over to something that could be constructed as imminent danger to a child. And the two categories that have often been used have been institutional abuse versus family abuse. And there too, I think it gets messy, because I'm sure that an awful lot of what you're finding could not necessarily be considered institutional, but is probably family instead. Yeah.
So we have about 20 minutes left. I would like to take some other questions from folks. So Dan, do you mind sitting down?
Sure. Can I just briefly acknowledge that? Point very well taken. I didn't mean to overstep in terms of like assuming that these less regulated, whatever. I just meant, I meant to say at the beginning, I am talking about spiritual abuse, which is, it's partially overlapping, not entirely. And I just want to say, I'll go further. When we talk about comparing religious groups to other religious groups, we can also compare to things like the Boy Scouts, who I believe have settled, right, like 12 times the lawsuits that the Catholic Church has settled. I mean, it's not like, I'm very aware of and want to be very careful around the demonization of religious groups on these lines, and not be accurately comparing them to what we understand to be sort of societal standards.
Thank you. Yeah, please approach the microphone and introduce yourself.
Justin Lether out of Salt Lake City. So I'm going to come at this at a little bit different angle. I want to really draw on like your expertise and your years of study on this. So you can adapt this question however you want, but if this panel were to write like starting an NRM for dummies, right? So from all of your work, like, have you seen practices of groups that are doing it right? Like, is there something that comes to your head that's like, oh, if you're going to start a new religious movement, like here's an angle and here's a group that I've actually studied, that this is a really healthy way to approach it?
You know, a new religious movement is inherently irrational. It started by a mystic who has a vision and who hears from, God or some spirit, and communicates it to close friends, family, and then somehow it grows and it changes. It's like a little seed. So really, they're not companies. It's not irrational. That's what I'm saying.
I think I agree completely with what Susan said, but I do think that there have been new religious movements who have suffered from certain issues and who have engaged in a process of reform, reflection, reconsideration, restructuring. I would bring out as an example the Hare Krishna movement, who, dealt with a number of allegations that there was sexual abuse going on in some of the schools that they ran in India for children of members that they were unaware of. They didn't believe the children at first, and then they realized that this actually was happening, and so they engaged in kind of a truth and reconciliation process, and it promoted more transparency. And I'm not saying that they've solved all of their problems with children, but at least they've tried to be very proactive about it and reaching out to governments, institutions, therapists, the public, and they seem to have weathered some of those storms. They're now obviously in their, well into their second generation. Obviously, LDS, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints has gone through a number of important transformations over the years in response to issues that have happened. Wouldn't you say that would be the case?
Definitely, yeah. Was it Justin? I really appreciate this question, and I'm still trying to figure out what's driving it, honestly, because I think it's really insightful. But I was thinking about my own personal studies, perhaps, and as a person of faith, kind of what that would look like. And I think the main thing that pops up for me is getting at core humanistic values. Essentially, it seems like something that would be there. Now, as I studied other religions, I think there is kind of for most religions at least, there's a core component of the golden rule, if you will, right? Learning to love one another or treat others as you would want to be treated, which seems like an essential component for something to be lasting. But I guess the other piece of that I'm still trying to put together is a mix of firmness or resoluteness with what you would want to be driving, along with adaptability, right? A firm and a flexible, if you will. Seems essential in trying to navigate or something that's going to stick, but something that can also be weathered over time. So just kind of initial reflections, thinking my own personal experiences at least, that's what immediately comes to mind.
So my driver here is really about, what I've heard you say is there would be real health in, 15 years of background as opposed to a journalist group that sneaks in over the weekend, right? If you're thinking about communicating and helping already existing NRMs, maybe to get away from abusive practices or to educate, the public or even constituents of these different groups, how would you, what's the, I can't think of the right term here, but what's the savvy, what would you teach the people, right? If you had the platform and the voice to be able to say, in order to stay safe and to educate across groups, what would be the right influence for an academic approach to this, to be able to say, if I were to take this academic and now move it into a conceptualized space of where the platform was really valuable and I could really make a difference here, how would you what pieces of the information that you possess after years and years of study would you want to get out into the public forum to create more savvy consumers in this space? And I know that sounds really weird, but that's kind of what's driving my thinking behind this.
Well, personally, I feel it would be very arrogant of me to go and tell charismatic cult leaders how to go about their business. I mean, it would be like going to some artist like Jackson Pollock or, Michelangelo and saying, hey, can you tone down your act, please? Can you, not be so wide? I mean, I see they're very much like creative artists. They're driven by these forces. They have enormous talent, or they wouldn't be able to get a following. So I think our job is just to sit back and watch. I mean, if you're asking about how to educate the public, which I think you're also asking about, I guess you have to tread the line between being academic and being entertaining. You want to get your stuff read. So, you have to reach the larger public. I guess you have to use the word cult in your title and tell entertaining stories at the same time, as using academic, theories and so on.
All I can respond to is the educating the public piece that Susan picked up on. I've heard Susan say several times that a cult is a baby religion. And I've heard Eileen Barker say something like, a cult is a religion you don't like very much. Sometimes I think in my head, so cults are babies we don't like very much. And I think holding on to sort of those two pieces, reminding people that these groups are very new. That's one of, not in every case, but often very new. And they're still figuring things out. And that the popular perception of a group is something that we need to kind of always be critiquing. I think it was Holly who said, we're kind of being educated through what's on HBO that weekend, and I think we can do better.
In terms of answering the question that we started with is, where's a group that's done it right? I would point you to the United Methodist Church, which coincidentally began to do it right at the very time they started recruiting a lot of females to the leadership. They have an excellent program for dealing with preventive measures. This is the same program the Southern Baptists are arguing about and just turned down the opportunity to pick up on in their problems that they have now with both sexual and physical abuse going on in their churches. And I would offer that. One of the problems you have with new religions is that they are trying to get away from the rules. Methodist Church has a 600-page book of rules that ministers, anybody in leadership, are expected to adhere to, and new religions want to focus on religious experience and the religious life and not have to deal with the denominational authorities and rules and all those kinds of regulations, and that's where they get themselves in trouble. And then that's additionally done about because most of these problems do not land in criminal court. They land in family court, and they land in civil court because they're about property and money, not about convicting criminals of illegal actions. So those are just a few observations.
I worry that I'm speaking at cross purposes, but I think this panel itself, we've elided physical abuse, psychological coercion, bad spiritual ideas, and sexual abuse, and I think it's very important to keep these categories separate in our discussion and also in our work. On the topic of sexual abuse, which I think is the one that's most serious, although I do not see it as one that's specifically endemic to new religious movements, one thing I think that I would say is everybody sucks at this. And it's not simply a question of how do we get new religious movements to do better, but something I've noticed in my own work and also unfortunately in my own family life is when a case of sexual abuse happens, especially with a child, everybody reacts badly. And this is true in secular environments as well as religious ones. And so I think one of the things that we all need to do is up our game and communicate to parents when there's a criminal trial that you cannot intimidate your child to get them to not testify against their grandfather. We need to communicate to people that children can have outsized reactions. We need to have a better, I don't want to say clinical, but maybe human understanding of the impact of horrific cases on families. We need to anticipate family breakdown. And we need as a society to work harder to support victims, whether they're members of controversial religions or not. So that's one thing I would say. The other thing I would also sort of bring up, and this goes back to this statement policy from the 1990s, is that we're speaking specifically about psychological abuse, especially when we're thinking about older minors who are past the age of consent and who are possibly still participating. I think it's important to communicate to older adults or older children their legal rights to participate or not participate in a religion. And then also, once people are past the age of 18, I think it would be healthy if our society asked people to take more responsibility for their beliefs and actions. And something I think the sad fallout of participating in a controversial religion, whether it's a mainstream group or a new religious movement, is people have the right to be wrong. And so if you've chosen over the age of 18 to participate in a group that you later on decide was abusive in some capacity, I think that our job is to say to somebody, you know what, nobody was physically forcing you to stay. I'm really, really sorry you burnt through several years of your life participating in something that you regret, but in order to have a free society, yes, people need to have the right to participate in things that they might later on regard as abusive. We can help them move on, but I think it's important to also communicate that part of freedom is that people are going to make bad decisions sometimes.
Well, Holly, I'm glad you made the point about people having the freedom to make bad decisions. I think you also mentioned that we had elided the question of sexual abuse or psychological coercion. I wasn't sure if you... Sexual, physical. Well, elided means omitted, and I don't think we intended to omit them. Oh, mix them all together, yes. I mean, we could certainly have an entire panel on each one of those topics, and it would be very important and interesting, and perhaps we should do that.
We have only a few minutes remaining. Is there anyone who hasn't gotten to speak yet who has a question for the panel?
Hi, I'm Christina Lee. I'm from Colorado State University, and one of the things I was really struck by in the conversation was that particularly in the court system, there's a bias against new religious movements, this assumption that the movements is the reason behind why they're guilty, or this kind of just bias against them, which seems very different from within court systems when you have people from a lot of times in mainstream religions, when they, even in cases where it is known they committed abuse, you see judges saying, well, we're going to not give them as hard of as a punishment because they're an upstanding Christian in our society, and so there's very much this major difference between the two. And earlier there was kind of a joke about whether or not to invite judges and lawyers to this conversation, and so I was just wondering what you thought should be kind of our role in contributing to these conversations about what happens in the courtrooms, and whether we should be inviting lawyers and judges to this conversation.
Again, to reiterate what I said before, I think anybody who is interested or involved party in the conversation should be part of the discussion, because otherwise people get cloistered in their own little niches professionally, ideologically. They don't get exposed to other perspectives, and they can just reify. I mean, I say this hypothetically. I have no idea if anybody that works this field happens to know attorneys or judges or people that should be part of this conversation, or they would be fruitful. But I'm just saying hypothetically, the more perspectives you bring to bear on the problem. I mean, it's almost like diversity in a garden, you know, with in an ecosystem. Bring more perspectives to bear, and maybe that then becomes a means of elevating the discourse, improving the conversation. But if certain people are excluded, then how will they ever be informed? How will they ever learn?
Well, there is some hope, because we do have, well, for example, Professor James Richardson in Nevada, who has what's it called, something of justice. Anyway, he has a program for educating judges in American religion and new religions. So he's himself a sociologist and a lawyer. So he's actively involved in making this, you know, bridging this.
I mean, I'd love
bridge.
to see a day, I can imagine, I don't know who would do this, if there was like a really astute article summing all of this stuff up, published in a law review.
Yeah.
You know, a major law review. I mean, that would be really significant.
Well, also Eileen Barker's organization Inform in London, now at King's College, they have Scotland Yard and judges and MPs, you know, I think on their board, and who come to their conferences, and they've done a very good job of getting journalists to call them instead of this local anti-cult group, which used to get all the attention from journalists. So I think things are improving here and there. There is some hope.
So it's now noon, which means it is not by any means the end of these conversations, but it is unfortunately the end of the panel.